Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Ibrahim Traoré's era. What I bring you today sounds almost unbelievable, like prophecy unfolding in our own time. France, the same nation that once paraded itself as the model of civilization, wealth, and stability, is now drowning in a sea of debt. Its government has fallen apart this very week. Its people are restless, and its future is clouded with uncertainty. France's debt has skyrocketed to a crushing €3.3 trillion with nearly €5,000 added every single second. It is a wound that keeps bleeding, a fire that cannot be put out. And now the empire that once mocked African nations with the word bankruptcy finds itself staring in the mirror at that same fate. But before we ask why France has collapsed today, we must ask a deeper question: how did France manage to stay alive for so long, even with its fragile economy? The answer, my people, is not hidden in Paris. The truth lies in Africa, in the secretive colonial arrangements that bound 14 African countries to send as much as 80% of their annual revenues straight to France for over half a century. Yes, for 50 years, France lived not on its own hard work, but on the blood and sweat of Africa. That colonial tax became the lifeline holding the French system together. For decades, the world was blind to this. People looked at France and saw a shining European power. What they didn't see was the silent robbery behind closed doors. Through the CFA franc system, the colonial tax and exploitative agreements signed under pressure, 14 African states were trapped in deals that robbed them of sovereignty and funneled their wealth into Paris. Year after year, billions of African dollars flowed silently into French coffers. It was this stolen wealth, not French brilliance, that funded their social programs, kept their economy stable, and gave them a fake image of strength. And this is why today's collapse shocks the West, but not Africa. Because Africa knew all along that France was never strong on its own. France only stood tall because it stood on Africa's back. Then came the storm. One by one, African nations began to cut the chain. Mali said no. Burkina Faso said no. Chad said no. Niger, which for decades poured its richest revenues into French hands, finally rebelled. These leaders expelled French troops, took back control of their natural resources, and declared proudly that Africa's wealth would stay in Africa. With every act of resistance, Paris grew weaker. With every nationalization, another hole opened in France's sinking economy. With every departure of French soldiers, the illusion of control fell apart. The rope that had tied France to African wealth snapped, and so did France's safety net of 50 years. And now we see the consequences. Major companies are leaving France. Investors are fleeing. Unemployment is rising and the state is choking under the weight of its own debt. In just 14 months, France has had 4 governments collapse and 4 different prime ministers. The once proud empire is showing the world that it has no foundation of its own. Meanwhile, the streets are overflowing with protests. People are demanding answers, and Europe is trembling, because France's collapse is not just France's problem, it is Europe's nightmare. If France can fall, who is next? Already the United Kingdom is staring down the same road. For now, Britain survives by leaning heavily on Nigeria, feeding off its oil, gas, and wealth. But experts are warning. If Nigeria follows Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, if Nigeria decides to cut Britain's chain, then the United Kingdom will crumble just like France. This is no longer economics. This is history correcting itself. Europe built its empire on Africa's back, stealing our resources, manipulating our currencies, and convincing us we were poor while they grew fat on our wealth. But now the tide has turned. Africa is rising, Africa is reclaiming, and Europe is collapsing under its own dependency. And so, my brothers and sisters, France's collapse is not bad luck. France is simply exposed. The mask has fallen, the system is broken, and the cracks can no longer be hidden. When a government collapses once, they call it politics. When it collapses twice, they call it instability. But when it collapses 4 times in just 14 months, they call it chaos. This is what France is today. The empire that once dictated to Africa now trembles in its own streets. Paris boulevards, once symbols of beauty and civilization, are now filled with smoke, burning tires, angry chants, and clashes with riot police. The French people are no longer fooled. Their wages are shrinking, but their bills keep rising. Their children cannot find jobs. Their parents cannot afford food. Their leaders make empty speeches while the government collapses again and again like a house of cards. Every week, protests grow. In Paris, thousands of youth march, accusing their leaders of betrayal. In Marseille, Factory workers flood the streets demanding justice. In Lyon, families lift empty plates as symbols of hunger. They are not only shouting against poverty, they are shouting against a state that has lost control, and the numbers themselves are terrifying. Unemployment spiraling with no end. These are not statistics on paper, these are daily wounds for ordinary French families. What shocks the French most is how quickly it all fell apart. Just a few years ago, they told the world they were a stable power, a leader of Europe, but today they are exposed, fragile and trembling. Inside Parliament, leaders argue, resign and collapse, but none dare speak the whole truth. They talk about reforms, they talk about management, they talk about politics, but they do not talk about Africa. They refuse to admit that France's survival for decades came from African blood. They refuse to admit that their fall began the very day Africa said enough, and so their people march, not knowing that their suffering today is the price of yesterday's colonial theft. When Ibrahim Traoré in Ouagadougou told French companies their free ride was over, Paris mocked him as a radical. When Assimi Goïta in Mali expelled French soldiers, Paris called him a rebel. When Abdourahmane Tiani in Niger cut uranium exports, Paris called it madness. But today, who looks mad? The Sahel leaders knew exactly what they were doing. They were not only freeing their people, they were exposing France to the world. They showed that without Africa, France is weak, broken, powerless. And now in Brussels, in Berlin, in London, European leaders whisper, if France can fall, we can fall too. Britain is already leaning too hard on Nigeria. If Nigeria follows the Sahel path, Britain too will taste the same collapse, the same protests, the same chaos. Europe has lived on Africa's resources for centuries, and now the foundation is cracking. My brothers and sisters, see the lesson clearly. France's collapse is not just a European crisis, it is Africa's proof of strength. The wealth of Africa is so powerful it can topple empires. For years we were told we needed Europe to survive, but now it is Europe that cannot survive without us. France is falling not because Africa is weak, but because Africa is awake. Europe trembles not because Africa is poor, but because Africa is rich and no longer willing to be robbed. This is not chance. This is justice. This is history. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Ibrahim Traoré's era. France is bankrupt. Its government is collapsing. Its people are restless, and its rope has been cut forever. The lifeline from Africa is gone, and it will never return. But for us, this is not a story of pity. It is a story of power. It shows that sovereignty is not a dream. It is a weapon. It shows that Africa's wealth is not small. It is so mighty that without it, Europe itself cannot stand. So let this be a warning to the West and a call to Africa. The age of dependence is over. The age of sovereignty has begun. France may collapse, Britain may follow, but Africa is rising. And once Africa rises, no empire on earth can bring it down again.